Kaise ho? Hello everyone, it's good to be here at BITS Pilani. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you especially to the whole Apogee team, especially Siddhant, who has been emailing me back and forth. Yeah, a trip like this takes months of planning that you never get to see behind the scenes. My trip out to India this time is 5 weeks long, visiting 6 universities, and so it's been about 6 months of planning to make this all happen. I love the theme of this conference, Think Again. So I was thinking about this today, and you've had some amazing people come to this conference. You have an ad guru having you think again about how to make that happen. You have a crazy Mumbai delivery man having you think again about that. And after me, you're going to have someone who's mixing two seemingly completely separate worlds of business and mythology and having you think again about that. So I thought about, what can I bring to this table? And I want to try to have you think again about the most basic thing that all of you think again about, and it's how you think itself. So I want you to think again about thinking. And then I want you to think again about thinking again about thinking. And then we'll keep going. So if we can start out, generally we can leave all the slides up the whole time. I'm going to be playing you guys stuff most of the time that I'm talking up here. I'm going to be showing you things on the side. So the less that you look at me, the better. The more that you look over to the sides, you're going to see a lot more interesting things than looking at me for an hour. So I really want to talk, to be more specific, about the ways that the human senses and the human mind interpret the reality that we live in. And we usually walk around from day to day and we think that the world that we live in is relatively straightforward, pretty easy to understand. We see each other, we take for granted that we are people, and from there we have a lot of assumptions that most of us really never question. And the more that I've spent time thinking about thinking and thinking about perception, the more I become confused about things that I used to think were very simple. And so I don't want to try to teach you anything today. I really just want you guys to have a good time. But if anything, I hope that you're more confused at the end of the hour than feeling like you have new kind of knowledge. I want to challenge all the things that you think you already know and have you maybe think again about them on your own. So I hope that you think of the next 50 minutes or so as a chance to start to question the things the way that we did when we were all 3 years old and we used to bug our parents about the very basic things in the world, about how we got here and who we are and where is Earth floating in space and how did the universe start, and all of these questions. All of us were asking these questions when we came around, and now we're usually very concerned about finishing a degree and finding a girlfriend and all these things, and we don't think about the kind of big universe questions. So I'm hoping that I can throw enough things up here and talk about enough things that you think you understand and show you that you don't understand them at all, that you get really confused and you go home and it keeps you up at night for a while. So, but as I said, I really want, more than anything, I want you guys to have a really good time. So no matter what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start with something that has absolutely no educational value whatsoever. And it's from Time Warp, the show that I hosted for a while. And here it is. All right, so this is using the slow motion cameras that we had on Time Warp. You're seeing the clips that I'm going to show you today are anywhere from 10 times slower than normal to 5,000 times slower than normal. So the cameras are really unbelievable machines. I did not invent the machines. I did not design them in any way, but we just used them. And I think we got a lot of really fun clips out of the last 2 seasons of the show. So I'm going to show you a bunch of these, but one thing I want to point out about this clip is probably some of you, when you saw this clip, you actually felt a little pain in your tongue. right? You kind of internalize this because you see this thing and you imagine what happens if it was your own tongue. And by the way, this is not my tongue. I would never do this on my own. This was a performance artist that we had on who knows how to do this without hurting himself really bad. But I want you to remember that everything you're looking at is really looking at a white screen that has nothing on it. And when you look at that white screen and it has certain shapes on it, your mind and your senses start to imagine that those things are real. You are not looking at a tongue, right? You are looking at a bunch of photons that are coming off of a projector that have some similar pattern to when you look at a tongue. And the ability of the mind to jump into the image is so strong that sometimes we forget that it's just an image. And one of the things I like doing about kind of having the lights low in the house while we give these talks is sometimes it's kind of like a movie theater. And when you go to a good movie, you forget that you're sitting in a theater, right? About 5 minutes into it, you're so wrapped up in what's going on that you forget that you're a person watching a movie, and suddenly there's just the watching of the movie. And that to me is one of the most interesting things that people don't usually think about, how easily this thing falls into realities and just accepts them as real. You know, you're watching James Bond and then all of a sudden you feel your own body, you know, dodging bullets and things like that. So this is a clip from the show, one of the really fun days. Yeah, we can leave the lights just about this and I'll keep myself in the light a little bit. This is me doing some skydiving on the show. TV is really all about kind of taking experiments that you could do on a table and trying to scale them up, you know, multiply them by 1,000 so that it's really exciting for people to watch. So this is comparing, you know, a more laminar flow shape, like a teardrop shape, to the cube that you can see in my other hand, and showing that one of them creates laminar flow and one creates turbulent flow. And of course you could do this kind of experiment for much cheaper on the ground, but that's not really as exciting to watch. And one of the things we were always trying to challenge ourselves with on the show was how do we take these concepts and instead of teaching them by showing you, 30 different equations that describe those things, how do we just make it so that someone that has no scientific background just thinks it's cool? Because once you start to think it's cool, you start to look around the whole world in a different way and you start to say, well, what does that look like in a different way? And what does that look like in a different way? And that's really what science is about. It's about this process of looking at things and trying to understand them more deeply. And if you're not curious about that, it doesn't matter how many formulas you know, you're never going to move yourself through that process. So that was what the challenge was for the show for me. But a lot of you probably only know me through the show, and I started the show when I was 30, so I thought I'd give you like 5 minutes of the first 30 years of my life that led to the show, so you have a little bit of context. This is me hanging out with my dad when I was probably about 8 years old. And I was always playing music. I was playing drums and saxophone and eventually piano, and I was drawing a lot. And I was really interested in math and science. And this was just how I was. This was how I came out of my mom, and just, this is what I liked doing. But for about 20 years, I really had no idea how I was going to combine those two worlds together. And the search for that goes on even today. When you wake up and you go to school and you work on science and art, science and math, and then you go home and you play some music or you do some drawing, those worlds feel very separate all the time. And probably a lot of you that are interested in engineering and science also have some interest in the arts. I saw a photography exhibit today, I saw paintings exhibits with ceramics, with all these different forms of art. Clearly there are people here that are interested in both worlds at the same time. And for me, for the first 20 years, this was a constant source of stress, because every time you spend an hour working on science, it's an hour that you're not spending working on photography or dance or music. And I always felt like I was trying to divide my time so much that I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. And so when I was trying to apply for colleges, I didn't know if I was going to apply to a science college or a music school. And I just decided at some point that it was easier to do music at a science school than it was to learn quantum mechanics at a music school. So eventually, I made it into grad school at the MIT Media Lab, and I started working on robotics. Undergrad, I was doing physics and math. And when I was a senior, I took a class in mechanical engineering, just learning how to build machines, and I got really hooked on that. And so I wanted to find a field that would kind of mix my physics and math background with some engineering and with building physical things. And so robotics was really great. But it also, on top of all that, allowed me to start mixing all the art that I wanted to be doing with all of the science together. And the first piece that allowed me to do this was a piece called Cyberchlor, which you see a picture here. You'll see a video in a second. This is about 10 years old now, but this is the kind of first piece for me where I was working on science and I was working on art and I was doing those things at the same time. And for me, that was a real turning point because it started opening my mind to the fact that all of these different interests could be one interest. And there's probably someone in the audience here that wants to work on mechanical engineering and dance at the same time, or architecture and neuroscience, and is always splitting time and trying to figure out how those worlds can be connected. And sometimes it takes a while for the mind to start to be able to think about these connections. So this is a piece, it's a pretty straightforward piece. I'll show you a little video. So there's 20 flowers in this field, 4 different types, and they're very, very simple. A lot of the time in robotics and artificial intelligence, you work with one robot that's very, very complicated with 40 or 50 motors. Each one of these has just 1 or 2 motors, very, very simple. It has 1 or 2 sensors, so also very simple. And the brain inside that's run by a computer is also very simple. But altogether, you have 20 of these machines running at the same time. And people just feel like they're interacting with something that's real. You can see some people here, and the flowers are able to track you if you move back and forth. If you move up slowly and close to them, they'll be engaged by you. The flower petals might open. But if you move too fast, they'll move into some kind of fear response where they'll try to retract away from you. And just by having 2 or 3 responses to 2 or 3 different sensor values, people were completely convinced that they were interacting with something that was in some way alive. And to me, that was really, really amazing and powerful. But I'll tell you one story about that piece that, oh, thank you. So I'll tell you one story about that, though, that really drove it home for me. And it was about 2 weeks before we finished that piece. And any of you know that if you build physical things, before you even hook up the sensors, you just run the motors over and over. You make the flowers go back and forth 10,000 times because you want to see what breaks. And that's just standard engineering practice. And so 2 weeks before this thing opened, we were showing these flowers in a museum, and they were running tours through the museum, but our exhibit wasn't even up. It was just running these tests over and over, the same loops over and over and over. And a woman on the tour came up to the flowers, and it was like between these 2 speakers inside. So she kept walking back and forth and moving around and looking at these flowers doing their dance. And after about 10 minutes of standing there, she walked up to me and she said, "I can't believe they know exactly what I'm doing." And she had just simply convinced herself that what they were doing was a response to her. And that to me was so deeply amazing because we spent so much time on the rest of it that we maybe didn't even need to spend time on all the intelligence. We might not have had to put any sensors in it in the first place. But a human mind, like I was saying with a movie theater, is so capable of believing in anything, whether it be a robotic pattern or whether it be a white screen, that once it believes it, it somehow makes it true. It somehow buys into this reality as if it's real in the first place, and it's actually just an illusion. So this was when I started to build pieces that were mixing art and science, and about 5 years after this, I had built several, and I had gotten a lot more comfortable with the 2 worlds together. And there's really no way to get comfortable with something like that without just showing up every day and working on it, and spending the hours and spending the hours. So about 5 years later, my friend Dan and I got a commission from a company called Absolute in Sweden. And they were interested in this concept of artificial creativity. So not only artificial intelligence, but what happens when artificial intelligence actually tries to create pieces of art itself? So we were asked to brainstorm ideas to explore this idea of artificial creativity, and both of us were working in robotics, and we were also working in music. We were both musicians, we both had bands, we were playing music all the time. And so we thought to ourselves, maybe we can mix these worlds together. Maybe we can make a robot that plays music in a way that a human being could never play themselves. And we came up with a bunch of ways to do this, and they liked one of them really well, and I'll show you a video of this in a second as well. But it's called Absolute Quartet because there are 3 machines, and you as the person that interact with those 3 machines make a quartet together. And you walk up to the machine, and there's a little piano keyboard, and whatever your musical background, you just hit a couple notes, you hit play for like 5 seconds on the piano, and it takes that 5-second melody, and using artificial intelligence routines, it turns it into a customized piece of 3-minute music. And once it has generated that piece of music, it plays it out on a robot that is playing in a way that a human being could never play. So you're going to see 3 instruments here. A kind of a standard electronic instrument is some solenoids hitting on percussion. You're going to see, for all of you guys who know the finger on a wine glass trick, where you take your finger and you rub the wine glass and it starts to make a tone, we built 35 robotic fingers that could play 35 different glasses. And then the main instrument is what we call a ballistic marimba, and I'm not going to explain what it does, you'll see in a second. These are played instead by throwing these tiny rubber balls about 3 meters in the air that are precisely aimed at the keys. So we estimated when we started this project that we were going to throw about 250,000 balls every day if this machine was running. And so our hardest task was that our engineering constraint was that throwing these balls, we could miss 1 in 10,000 of them. And even if we missed 1 in 10,000, there were going to be 25 rubber balls on the floor every day. So we had 4 months to work on this project. It was a crazy, crazy schedule. And we spent more than half of the entire development just prototyping one single throwing mechanism. We made 5 different prototypes eventually to build up this kind of precision and accuracy. And then the rest was building the wine glasses, building the percussion, manufacturing 42 of these machines, and putting them all together. Thank you. So meanwhile, while I was working on all this robotics and sculpture work, I was always interested in photography. This started for me probably when I was 15 or 16, and when digital photography came out, which for me happened during my lifetime, it was a real big switch. You could start, taking thousands and thousands of photos and not paying thousands of dollars to develop a film. So this is a photo that my brother took of me when we were in Bali, Indonesia, at a place called the Balinese Monkey Forest. And when you go there, there are just hundreds of monkeys running all over the place. They will just stand on your head. It doesn't matter. They're very, very comfortable with humans. And when you bring a camera that has a large lens like these do, this has a 77mm lens, when a monkey sees you from far away and you're pointing the camera at them to take a picture, suddenly they see their own reflection, and it's big enough to see their whole head in the reflection. But a monkey doesn't understand that its reflection is itself. And so the monkeys come right up to the camera to try to meet these other monkeys that seem to be on the inside of the camera. And so that's why this picture actually happened. I was about to take pictures of them, and they all crawled in to try to make friends with the monkeys hidden inside my camera. And this, once again, was such a deep shift for me once I started thinking about it. It's one of these things that's just kind of funny to see, but then you back up for a second and you realize that most animals that exist on the planet have no idea that they exist. right? Most animals exist and they're intelligent and they know exactly what to do and they know how to hunt and they know how to avoid predators, sorry. And yet when they look in a mirror, they think it's something else. When a dog looks in a mirror, it actually has no idea that it's a dog on some level. And that to me is a really, really amazing thing about the human mind, its ability to notice a reflection and then think that the reflection is the real thing. I mean, how often when we're looking in the mirror do we actually think the thing on the other side is actually the real thing instead of just, you know, a bunch of photons bouncing around the room showing a reflected image? That to me has kind of continually confused me the more and more that I think about it. And I hope next time you look in a mirror it will start to confuse you as well. Because no other animal can do that. And the more that I shot photography, the more that I started thinking about the way that perception works. And how is it that we take in these photons and we start to construct an entire model of the universe? Now, all of you probably in engineering school have seen this diagram before. This is the only science slide I will show for the whole talk. But this is the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So this is every type of light that we know of that exists in the natural world, everything from gamma rays to radio waves. So we tend to forget that when we use our cell phone, that we're communicating with light. And when we heat our food with a microwave, that we're using light bouncing off in there to heat the food. And this is because we have this tiny little slit between the ultraviolet and the infrared that our eyes are sensitive to. And everything that's not in that tiny slit of visible light of the whole rainbow spectrum is totally invisible to us. And that's 99.999% of the light that's even in this room. We see less than 1% of the light in this room, and when we see that light, we think that that's the way really things are. Right? Even though we're not seeing almost everything in this room, we think that our view of reality is the whole view, it's the full picture. And it's just totally false, right? So when you walk around, it's not even something that comes up in question. You know, William Blake talks about the doors of perception. We use perception to have a window into this world, but we actually usually forget that the window has a frame and that we're seeing a tiny little bit of what's going on. And so this started to really captivate me because some other animals have a completely different range of the universe they see, like a snake. So this is a snake attacking a water balloon that we filmed on the show. It's about 50 times slower than normal. So we had some snake experts on the show to help us set up shots like this. These are really, really poisonous and you don't want to work with them unless you really know what you're doing. So we asked the snake experts, we want to set up this balloon and we want the snakes to attack it. So what color does the balloon have to be? And the experts told us, well, it actually doesn't matter what the color is because snakes are completely blind to the visible spectrum. They have two eyes that over millions and millions of years went blind, and they evolved two new eyes called Jacob's organs that are like, you know, where our cheeks would be. And those new eyes only see in the infrared part of the spectrum, right? They only see the kind of heat that comes off of animals. And when you're running through, you know, slithering through the grass, it doesn't really help to see the green of the grass. It helps to see the warm animal that's behind all those cold leaves. And so, even though they're visibly blind, they have an image of what this thing is through a totally different part of the universe, and probably they also imagine that what they're seeing is the whole picture. But when we asked the snake experts what color the balloon needed to be, they said it doesn't matter because if it's a blue balloon or an orange balloon, it makes no difference. But you have to fill the balloon with very hot water. And if you use cold water, they'll think that it's a rock. But if they use hot water, then they'll think it's some kind of mouse or something, and they'll attack it. So the question for me is, what is it like to look through those Jacob's organs as a snake? It's some kind of vision, just like the way your eyes work. And probably just like you, they think that this is the only thing that exists in the universe, and that's their whole model of the reality. But our two models don't even overlap at all. So that's really an amazing thing to me. And this gets more and more and more confusing the more that you think about it. And probably if you've studied philosophy or the philosophy of perception or any of this, you've thought a little bit about how we perceive color. And even to say the idea is that we perceive color is totally false. Because the only thing that differentiates gamma rays, from radio waves, from visible light, from all of the colors from one another, is the amount of times per second that this electromagnetic field is vibrating back and forth. And so red may vibrate back and forth 200 billion times a second, and green may vibrate back and forth 300 billion times a second as a field. But the photons that come off this screen are just an electromagnetic field vibrating back and forth, and only when they go into your eye is there a perception of color. When you look in the brain, there's obviously nothing red inside the electrical circuitry of the brain. You can cut someone's head open and you will never find the red that they're looking at, right? But also, before the person is there, there's nothing red about the screen itself. Another animal could perceive this 200 billion vibrations a second as green if their eyes and the system works differently. So the fundamental paradox for me is that when you are all looking at this red screen, you think that you're actually looking at a screen that's red, but you're not. There's nothing red about the screen. Red only happens when you combine the information from the environment with the system that perceives it. And in some sense, you can't even separate the two. Red only exists in the combination of those two things. So if you think you ever see anything on the outside that is fundamentally the way it is on the outside objectively, you're totally wrong. And if that doesn't confuse you, you're just not paying attention to what I'm saying. So I got really interested in all of these ranges of the spectrum that we don't see, and I built this piece called Light Bulb. Now, light bulb is a piece that looks really, really simple until you start to look a little closer. Let me turn this around a little bit. So light bulb is exactly what it looks like in the picture and in the movie. It's a floating light bulb. It's about 10 centimeters away from anything. You can put your hands all around it. It's just floating in midair. And until someone understands how it works, it should be completely like magic. When a lot of people walk up to this, the idea anyway is that they completely stop thinking because it's so startling, it breaks all your expectations. But any of you that know engineering know how to do this kind of thing. You hide magnets inside the bulb, you put an electromagnet up top, and you put a sensor somewhere where you can tell, 1,000 times per second, where is that bulb? And if the bulb is a little lower than you want it to be, you increase the strength of the electromagnet, and if it's a little too high, you push back on it. And if you do that fast enough, and you do that intelligently enough, you can hold this thing in midair, and it looks like it's not moving. But if you look really up close, it's doing these tiny shaking movements all the time as it keeps restabilizing itself. Now the other thing about this piece is that it's transmitting all the power wirelessly through the air. So there's no batteries hidden inside this bulb. There's a big antenna up top, hidden up top, just like there is when you see a radio station antenna. It beams out information. And any of us that had a radio in this room, if we had a proper tuner, we could get the information and listen to the song on the radio. Now we always forget that there are radio waves in this whole room all the time, but yet we can use our cell phones all the time, and you can bring a radio anywhere and hear that frequency. So I designed in here a circuit that is basically a radio station up top, but it's only about 10 centimeters away from the radio receiver, so you can beam an immense more amount of power into the bulb, and it will light itself up through the circuitry inside. So this is the kind of bulb that it could be floating, not touching anything except air, and you could leave it there for 20 years or 100 years, and it would never turn off. Thank you. So this is a very weird experiment that I want to tell you that was done by a guy named George Stratton. He did this experiment about 100 years ago. There's nothing high-tech about this experiment at all, but it's totally kind of flabbergasting when you hear what happens. He wanted to understand how much this brain is controlling what we see and how easy the brain could manipulate the information coming into the mind, coming into the visual perception, and fundamentally change it. And so what he did is he built these special pairs of glasses that were full of prisms, and when you look through the glasses, everything looks upside down. So imagine you had these glasses on right now. I would look like I was on the ceiling, and the ceiling would look like it was the ground, and I was standing upside down giving you this talk. And if you imagine trying to walk around with those kind of glasses on, it's really, really disorienting because left and right are screwed up and down are screwed up. And when people tend to put these glasses on for a while, they get really nauseous and sometimes they throw up because it's so uncomfortable. But he really wanted to understand how deep these things went. And so he convinced some of his grad students, and he himself also wore these glasses for days and days, just to see what would happen. And miraculously, about 4 days into wearing these glasses, all of a sudden, the brain flipped the image upside down. And so all of a sudden, everything that was upside down was right side up, and totally comfortable, and when you took the glasses off, the whole world looked upside down. So maybe that's the clearest example of think again, right? We think of things like up and down as totally fundamental reality, of this is down and this is up, and yet so much of that is transformations that are happening in the brain that we don't even know about. And more modern science has tried to recreate this kind of thing in other animals with simpler brains, like reptiles, like frogs. And it's a kind of a gross experiment, but I'll take 30 seconds to explain it to you anyway, because you can't really easily put glasses on a frog. So instead, they anesthetize the frog, and they cut the eye sockets out of the frog, and they pull the eyes out, and they flip them upside down, and they glue them back into the eye sockets. Right? So this is modern science and how it works sometimes. But the weirdest thing about this is they wanted to see if the same kind of thing happens, but the brains of a frog are totally different and a lot simpler than the brains of a human being. And so for the rest of the life of the frog, if it sees a fly up here, it will stick its tongue into the ground. And it will never feed itself, right? So we have very, very complex brains, and because of that, we have so many new ways that we filter the world that most other animals don't even have those kind of reference points. And so this is another case where the more I thought about it, the more it kind of freaked me out. So I started thinking about why is it that we view this visible part of the spectrum and everything else is invisible? And I started looking at the data coming in from my digital SLR. And when you take a photo with a digital SLR, you capture more information than the eye can see. You see a little into the UV, you see a little into the IR, but you also get more of the blue frequencies, and there's a lot of information there that the human eye just doesn't notice. And so I started working with these photos where I was just pushing up and down on the amounts of reds and blues and greens, and sometimes a little of the infrared. And you're seeing the original, and then you're seeing it transformed into just a different frequency spectrum. But the thing about it to me is that when you see them transformed, it always looks like it's fake. It always looks like it's surreal or some way, or processed. But if your eyes worked in a different way, that would be the normal way that you saw people. That would be the normal way that you saw landscapes. And when you saw the first half, that would be the thing that looked all surreal to you. So even our notions of what is real and what is fiction in terms of things like photography are just based on the random way that your eyes work and not on some kind of fundamental understanding of how they really are. Okay, so we talked a little bit about all the frequency ways that our eyes are kind of lying to us and convincing us that we know what's going on. So let's talk about a couple other ones. We are very, very comfortable. We have really good intuition for things that are our size scale, right? So when we talk to another human being, we understand what it feels like to be 2 meters tall. And when we look at a mountain range that's maybe 10 kilometers long, we're pretty comfortable with those distances. We feel them in some intuitive way. When we look at a grain of salt, we're pretty comfortable with that because it's on our scale. But as soon as we leave those scales, all of our intuition goes totally out the window. So I'm going to show you 2 examples. This is a photograph from an electron microscope, which is magnifying something by about 10,000 times larger than normal. So if you have never seen this picture before, does anyone have any idea what this is? Because all of you know what this is. I think I heard the right answer, but I guarantee that the person that said it has seen this picture before. This is a piece of chalk up close. Now, where does chalk come from? Chalk comes usually harvested out of rocks. And how did those rocks form? Those rocks formed because for hundreds of millions of years, microscopic animals were living in the seas, and as they died, they went and sunk to the bottom of the surface. And billions of these microscopic organisms sunk down to the surface and got compressed. And we find these things maybe 2 billion years after they died, and they're so compressed that they look like chalk to us. But when you look under a microscope, all you're seeing are these skeletons of these animals compressed into this white powder. So every single time you're writing with a piece of chalk on a blackboard, you're actually smearing a bunch of skeletons all over the board, and you're doing this kind of cannibal thing. But next time you grab a piece of chalk, look up close. You cannot see that with your own eyes. It's absolutely outside of the range of your perception, and there's nothing that the body on its own can do to understand that part of the world. It's completely alien to us, and we have no intuition for the things that happen in quantum mechanics because we don't see quantum mechanics every day. You know, if we grew up and the world that we noticed was quantum mechanical, it would be very easy to understand, but it's not. When we learn it, it seems really confusing because we're not at that scale. And if we look in the other direction, I'll come back to this slide later, but if we look into space, once again, we completely lose our intuition for how things work. You know, if I ask you if I'm 2 meters tall or 20 meters tall, I hope that all of you will get the right answer, right? It's very intuitive. But if I ask you if the sun is 700,000 kilometers in diameter or 7 million kilometers in diameter, and you don't already know the answer, probably half of you will get it right because you'll all just be guessing at random. The difference between 700,000 kilometers and 7 million kilometers is absolutely gigantic. And if we lived on that size, if we were the size of a solar system, we would be comfortable with that kind of thing. You would just see it and you'd know, just like you know that I'm about 2 meters tall, unless you think I'm 20 meters tall. And even on our own scale, our brain is fooling us all the time about what is real and what is not. It tries to take, you're receiving almost an infinite amount of information through your senses, and you have to simplify that. The brain is always trying to simplify the picture to understand things more simply, to be able to tell you what to do, right? You only need to know exactly what to do, so you don't have to know the 40 billion pieces of information that are coming at you every second. So this is one example of a visual illusion that really highlights all the ways that our brain plays tricks on ourselves. So if you look at the square that's marked A and the square that's marked B, and your eyes work normally, which one's brighter? Right, no one even has to say it. It's so obvious that B is brighter that no one has to say anything. But they're exactly the same. Right, so I'm going to take these bars away again, and now you tell me which one is brighter. Right? For maybe a split second, you still feel like they're the same, but then as soon as you look away and you look back, your brain tells you once again B is much brighter. So I'm going to just toggle them for a couple times so you can convince yourself that I'm not playing any trick on you. You're playing a trick on yourself. So why is this one happening? This is one of the very simple cases to understand why this works. This would not work if that green cylinder was not in the picture. So that's a pretty big hint. But if you look at the green cylinder, it's casting a shadow over the whole middle of the board. And your brain is so smart at taking all the information in and processing it, and it knows so much about the way that the Earth works that it says, okay, I know about shadows, and I know that anytime I have an object and I bring it into a shadow, it gets darker. And so anytime I see something in a shadow, in my mind, I'm automatically going to make that thing look brighter because I know that it's actually brighter. And so you see this kind of thing, and automatically your brain fools you to try to give you a simple picture. All right, so that one was a weird one, but this one to me is the weirdest visual illusion that I've ever seen. I hope that you all have a clear view of this. If you don't, try to look at the other one or something like that, and I hope it's big enough for this to work for everybody. In order for this illusion to work, you have to be very attentive. You cannot move your eyes at all. You have to really pay attention. And don't worry if you don't see anything yet, because the illusion is a motion illusion. There's 11 pink dots, and one of them is missing. And I'm going to start an animation that moves that moving dot, a missing dot, around in a circle. So you can always see there's 11 moving dots, and one of them is missing. So just convince yourself of that for a second. And now get all of your focus ready, and completely stop paying attention to any of those dots. okay? Pretend they don't exist, and look instead at the cross in the middle, without blinking and without moving your eyes, for about 10 seconds. All right, if it's not working, you're moving your eyes too much or you're blinking. And I'll let it run for another couple seconds. If people haven't gotten it yet, cover one of your eyes up. Sometimes that helps you focus and it helps you kind of not blink and not move your eyes at all. If you only pay attention to the cross in the middle and you pretend like the pink dots don't matter, it will confirm that and all the pink dots will disappear. And instead you'll just see the inverted image of a green dot moving around in a circle. Now I'm not changing anything, just your attention moving back and forth completely flips the image of reality that you get from the screen. Right, so think again. So, there's a rumble in the audience. Okay, that's a good sign. People are arguing about these things and whatever, that's always a good thing. I hope you're slowly getting more and more confused as we go through this. So this is the most recent piece that I finished with a couple other companies. As the time has gone on, the pieces have gotten a little more complicated and a little bigger as we've gotten more comfortable. This is a piece we finished about a year ago called Pattern by Nature, and it's in the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it's a piece about the way that we pattern things in science. The way that science is about looking for patterns that we find in nature and kind of distilling out those patterns. And if you look at the theories that we develop in science, it's always this case. We see a bunch of phenomena, and we try to derive what are the simplest patterns that describe the most variety of these phenomena, right? So we come up with things like Maxwell's equations to describe all the electromagnetic phenomena, or general relativity to describe all these things about, not only the speed of light, how it might relate to gravity, all these different things. We're always trying to go simpler and simpler to describe more and more patterns. And so this piece is about that, but it's also about one other thing. It's also about the fact that when you see a pattern, any kind of pattern, your brain tends to focus on that pattern and it forgets what that pattern is made of. So what you're going to see here are liquid crystals that are about 20 by 20 centimeters. And a liquid crystal, all of you know what a liquid crystal is if you've ever seen a normal calculator display, like a 7-segment display or anything like that. It's just two pieces of glass, and in between the two is a little liquid crystal film that if you run an electric current through it, it twists the polarization of light in a way that makes the glass go from completely transparent to completely opaque. So you'll see these pieces of glass that are clear, and when we run current through them, they turn black. So we're essentially making a non-flat, transparent display. So that's the technical side. But what I want you to think about in the back of your head when you watch this is you're sometimes just going to be seeing 3 or 4 of these pixels turning from clear to black and clear to black. But as soon as your brain sees that they make a pattern of any sort, you totally stop noticing that individual pixels are not moving, and instead you see these shapes that are moving. And so you're lying to yourself all the time in some sense when you see this motion that isn't really happening. So how much did you forget that you were looking at individual blocks turning on and off when you saw that, right? Okay, so back to Einstein for a second. We've talked about the tiny range of frequency that you see with your eyes, the tiny range of size that you're comfortable with in the world. The one that people know me most about, most through, is the work with time, and how little of a time window we have on the world that we're comfortable with, and how much we think that that's really all there is, the way things actually move through time. So think for a second about the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is almost 2 kilometers deep. It runs in Colorado and Arizona through the Colorado River, cutting out these molecules of dirt and rock from the bottom. And when you go to the Grand Canyon and you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon and you look down, it looks like it's a geologically completely static, finished event. Right? We come to it 17 million years after it started forming, and we get to it and it just looks like it's finished. Right? It looks like it's not changing at all. But in fact, in the average human lifetime, it gets about 1 centimeter deeper. And it's still doing that. And that seems like nothing, but when you wait 17 million years, you get the Grand Canyon out of nothing. And if you imagine that our nervous systems worked at a different scale, if you lived for 1 billion years, then 17 million years would just be a couple hours going by, and you'd be able to sit there and you'd be able to watch this thing form, and you'd realize all the time that this thing is always changing, but it feels like it's static. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have literally light. Light, which to our best measurements moves in 1/1000th of a second, it moves a meter, right? So when you turn the lights on in this place, it actually takes several billionths of a second for the light to leave the lights and to bounce off all the walls and to bounce off all of you and to bounce off me and reach your retinas. And if our nervous system had to work on that kind of scale, like an atomic scale of time, we would see that happen. We would switch the lights on and we would see that that is moving, but instead it looks like it's infinitely fast. So we have this tiny window talking to other human beings, waiting 5 minutes for something that we're really comfortable with, and then as soon as we leave that scale, things are either totally unchanging or infinitely fast. And those are both false, because everything is always in a process of change, regardless of our window on it. So I got really interested in this when I was in grad school at MIT, because the person who invented high-speed imaging, the only reason my show ever existed, started 80 years ago with a guy named Harold Doc Edgerton. And if you're interested in any of that kind of high-speed imaging, you gotta look this guy up. He invented the first high-speed strobes that would show you 1/1000th of a second strobe lights. You could trigger images that were 1/1000th of a second long. And I took a course where 80 years later they teach these techniques, and the techniques are actually pretty simple. You can use a normal digital SLR. You just have to have a strobe light that blinks really fast, and you have to be able to trigger it at the right time. So while I was looking at all these ways to mix art and science together, suddenly I was taking this class, and I wanted to trigger events that were 1/1000th of a second long, but some of them I wanted to trigger were with bullets. And if you don't trigger those at the right time, the chances that you're going to set the flash off at the right time are almost zero, because every 1/1000th of a second it moves like 5 or 10 centimeters. So you have to have roughly 1/1000th of a second timing accuracy, and so I had to build custom circuitry that would have little laser lights, and it would time when the bullet crossed that path, and then it would trigger the strobe a couple millionths of a second later to place it in the right point. So what you're going to see here is kind of like my final project for that class, where it was a bunch of photos, and most of them are 1/1000th of a second shots triggered with electronic circuitry. So this is just water coming down from every normal sink faucet. And the second one is a little tricky to detect at first. It's a very close-up of a bullet going through a falling drop of water. Oh, wait for it, there's more. We got a bullet going through soap. This is kind of a classic one that they do in that kind of lab. This was another one of the really tricky ones. This is a bullet being fired at a knife, and the knife cuts the bullet in half. This is another bullet photo going through some colored pieces of chalk. And the final one is a composite. It's actually from a high-speed video where I took a little piece of plastic and just let it fall into the water. And I kind of did it 20 times, and I took high-speed videos of them and took 4 frames of the video that I thought were just really beautiful and composited them together as if it looked like it was one event. But that's, yet again, it's just another trick of Photoshop. So I was doing this sort of thing, and I put all this work online just because I wanted other people to be able to see it. And this was like 2003 or so. And 5 years later, completely out of the blue, I was working on my graduate degree at the Media Lab, my PhD, which I never finished because of the show. And I got a phone call out of nowhere, and they said, we saw your work, and we're trying to make a show where we show people things they can't see themselves, and then we talk about the science. And we need someone who's a photographer and can make these things look beautiful, but can also talk about the science and the physics that underlie it. And there's not a lot of guys that combine those worlds together, so I got the job really easily. I didn't have to even apply. So that's how I started hosting Time Out. So if any of you are interested in getting into TV, I have no good advice for you because I have no idea how to do it. But what I can do is show you some of my favorite clips from the show. And all these tiny little windows that a human being never notices on their own, and your eyes will never tell you yourself. But if you use these pieces of technology, these little windows where it looks like you have a very clear idea of how things work. As soon as you look closer, the closer you look, the less you know. And the more that you see that there's a mystery underneath. So I'm going to show you 5 of my favorite clips, but these are not going to be clips that are very, very weird kinds of chemical explosions or anything like that. They're going to be very, very simple things that all of you are pretty much familiar with. And that's I think, the most dramatic examples because all of your expectations will be broken, I hope, in every single one of these clips. So the first one is 2 clips of music. And if you've studied anything about music, you know that the vibrations in music start to be audible to your ear when they happen about 20 or 30 times every second. But if you wave something back and forth 20 times a second, it starts to blur in your eye because the chemical processes are too slow. So there's no part of music that you can hear and you can see at the same time how that sound is being made. So we slow these things down about 100 times slower than normal, and you can see exactly how sound is produced by vibration. So this looks like it's totally unlike anything you've ever seen before, but every single time you hear anything, this is how the sound is being created. I don't even have to use a microphone. Right, I slap my leg, and everyone in this room can hear that. Right, think for 15 seconds about the process that is happening when I slap my leg. When I do that, the pants and the leg vibrate back and forth maybe 500 times a second and maybe 1/100th of a millimeter back and forth. And all of the air around that gets compressed and expanded 500 times a second. And those waves travel out in every direction, just the way that water waves do. They have enough energy to go and bounce off every wall in this room, and they have enough energy to send those vibrations into every ear in this room, and vibrate little microscopic hairs in every ear in this room, and all of you hear something that sounds probably really similar to one another. This is what happens every time you hear anything, and yet to our normal perception it's completely invisible and unperceivable. This example is maybe the most weird of all the examples I'm going to show you, except the last one. This is a skateboarder named Greg Lutzka, who is a street skateboarder, and he's doing a trick that's called a 360 kickflip. And for most of you that are not skateboarders, myself included, a 360 kickflip is when you take a skateboard and you flip it on its own axis 360 while you flip it on this axis 360 at the same time. Is there anyone in here that can do one of these, by the way? No, I thought so. It's very amazingly difficult for any of us to try. But this guy's been skateboarding probably for 10 or 20,000 hours by now, and it's really easy for him. To me, the more that I slow that clip down, the more it looks like it's not going to work by the end. Right? It's almost done and it's totally in the wrong place, and there's no way just by flicking his ankle a little bit that he could learn how to do this exactly. But the funniest thing about filming this day, I'm going to play this again, and instead of looking at what he's doing, look at how we did the camera work. You'll see that we're sliding the camera a little bit. We're actually sliding it on another skateboard to try to make the shot a little more dramatic. And that's called a dolly shot. Now, setting up a shot on time warp maybe looks really straightforward, but the amount of light that you need to make these things work is enormous because your shutter speed has to be so fast. And trying to get dolly shots like this synchronized with a performer is just it's a nightmare on some time. This shot itself took about 4 hours to get right. And that's about average for us on a day. We usually have to work 16 hours a day to make 4 or 5 minutes of TV. But when we shot that dolly shot, we needed to have him do this 12 times because we couldn't get all those things synchronized. We couldn't get the thing moving and the lighting right and all this stuff at the same time. And so we asked him every single time, okay, another 360 kickflip. And every single time he just kind of did this and it was nothing and he got it perfect. Right, so we felt a little stupid that day. It was early in the first season. We were like, we don't know what we're doing. But the reason I bring that up is because there's something really special about intelligence. And I think that what we tend to do when we're learning science and when we're learning engineering is that we think that the first 3 centimeters of our brain is the only important part of our brain. Right? We think that all the formulas that we learn and the concepts that we learn are the most important thing. And when we meet people that have learned in a very, very deep kind of motor skill way, or maybe they're a piano performer, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. If someone has spent thousands and thousands of hours on something, they develop a sense of intuition that is so much more powerful than thinking, that when they're doing something like this, the only thing thinking can do is screw everything up and make them mess up. And any of you that do any kind of public performance, where you practice hundreds of hours for a dance performance, or for a piano performance, or for a public skateboarding thing, and you get to the performance, what is it that your mind can do, right? You can either, your body knows exactly how to do these things at this point, but your mind can all of a sudden say, oh no, I'm gonna screw up, or oh no, people are gonna hate what I play in a second. And that has the ability to ruin everything that the other intelligence in your body already knows how to do. And the more that I meet people that are experts in totally different fields, and this includes things like physics, it doesn't mean you can't be thinking, but people learn how to enter a zone that they call being in the zone in sports, or they call flow in psychology. And the more time that you spend doing one of these things, the more you learn to pay so much attention to what you're doing that you don't pay any more attention to your own existence. And that's a really tricky thing to understand at first, but all of us have these sometimes experiences where we get so lost in what we're doing that we forget to eat dinner, or we forget to return phone calls, or all this kind of thing. And it's because we stop thinking about ourselves, because the only thing that's happening is the action. And contrary to the idea that this is a bad thing, or that thinking always needs to be there, sometimes the irony is that the less we think about ourselves, the more the natural intelligence in our thinking and moving minds is able to naturally do what it knows how to do in a flawless way. And the consequence of that is that the irony, the less we think about ourselves, the more happy we tend to be about ourselves. And that's really, really a tricky, tricky thing when you start realizing it. So let's go back to the simple, simple things about the world around us. I'm going to show you a soap bubble. And first I'm going to ask if anyone in the audience has never seen a soap bubble pop. Okay, good. So you know what that looks like, right?
at 5,000 frames a second. A simple ball bearing is the projectile of choice to accomplish the task.
It's coming down. Ready?
At normal speed,
How was that?
it looks like the bubble just explodes. But is that what's really happening?
So there it is. You never think of it as a directional event. It just looks like it's there and it's gone.
Watch the bubble burst again, even slower this time. There's some complex science going on here. Surface tension holds the soap bubble molecules together, while the air inside the bubble is forcing them apart. When the bubble begins to tear, soap molecules shoot out in all directions as tiny droplets.
All right, so that was soap, something that you guys all know about. And so what's simpler than soap? How about just water? The simplest thing that we know of, pretty much, right? It makes up most of your body. You have to drink it every day, you'll die, all these kind of things. Everyone knows about water. So Matt and I had already seen some of Doc Edgerton's work taking high-speed photos of water, and we knew that when you look at it up close and slow it down, it looks amazingly beautiful. But you can imagine that when we talked to the production company and we said, we need to bring in this photographer who just shoots water drops, and we're just going to shoot water for 16 hours. It's going to be fantastic. You can imagine that they were totally unenthusiastic. And so they told us, absolutely not. We're going to shoot some more explosions and all these gymnasts and all this kind of stuff. So for months, Matt and I were writing them emails every week. Just please let us have one day with this guy, Martin Waugh, who's a water drop photographer. Let us video water drops. And so finally, about 4 or 5 months into it, right near the end of the first season, they let us have one day with water drops.
Really scary.
That is one drop of water. And it all pulls back up.
Right in the center, kaboom.
And a huge tower.
Well, not the reactions.
Yeah, right. Newton's laws never this good. If there was no surface tension, everything would just go infinitely outward. You can write out the equations, but you're never going to expect it. It's this beautiful.
Boy, it doesn't take much. I raise it up just ever so slightly.
Now it's way fast. Okay, ready?
Go. First drop. Coordinates.
Takes a while.
Falls back. Up. The spike comes.
Wow, they did it!
Every day, billions of people depend on water to live. They interact with it. It rains outside, and there's millions of drops hitting the ground. Every single one of them is doing this. And I think no one really gives that the attention that it deserves. That is unreal. All right, so that's the footage they got back. And thank you. So what do you think they said at the end of seeing that footage? They said, can we do another day on water drops as soon as possible? And so the next clip I'm going to show you is also looking at water, but it's looking at water even closer and even slower. And it's looking at a new phenomenon. And the only thing that we've changed that you're going to see in this clip is you're looking at the tip of a syringe holding a tiny droplet of water about 1 centimeter above the surface of water. Now, because it's so much closer, before we were dropping these things from like 50, 60 centimeters above, now it's 1 centimeter, and so the only difference is the inertia versus the surface tension has changed. There's much less inertia at work. And look what happens when that's the only thing that we change. admit that you guys have never clapped for water before. Congratulations to water. It's an amazing, amazing thing. Okay, so these are a bunch of examples. You know, we look closer at frequency, we look closer at size, we look closer at time. In all of these ways, everything we take for granted is totally wrong. We have this tiny little window on the way things are, and we assume it's real and we assume it's right, and the closer we look, the more we see that it's a very, very limited perspective. So I want to back up and I want to just talk about one more thing before we get into some questions. And it's not anything really, really specific like this. It's the big picture, backing up and looking back at these questions that we used to ask when we were children. Now, a lot of you have seen this picture before, the tree of life, how Earth started to sprout out bacteria and multicellular creatures and reptiles and mammals and man, all this sort of thing. Now, regardless of your belief of any of this, every one of you believes that you have two parents. Any exceptions? Right, none. Now look what happens just from that one assumption that you have two parents, and I'm not denying that assumption. Let's take that as a fact. You have two parents, that means you have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. So how many great 10 times grandparents do you have, right? You have 2 to the 10th, 1,024. Every computer scientist knows that by heart, right? So you go 10 generations back, and you're automatically related to at least 1,024 people, not even mentioning brothers and cousins and all that sort of thing. But 10 generations takes something like 250 years. It's not even that far back. So go back 20 generations, go back 500 years. All of a sudden, you're at 2 to the 20th relatives. You're related to 1 million different people, at least. And that's 500 years back. What if we go back 30 generations? You're related to 1 billion different people, 750 years ago. Let's go back 40 generations, just 1,000 years, just 1013 AD. And you're related to about 1 trillion different people. Now, we don't even think there have been 1 trillion people on the planet. We think maybe there's been something like 100 billion people on the planet. So what does that mean? That means that you don't have to go that far back to suddenly be related to every single human being that's on this planet. We don't even have to really look at all the details to understand this. We think that about 75,000 years ago, all of us had shared common ancestry. And if you really let that sit down, it means we might not know the details of the family tree, but look to your left and look to your right, because that is a cousin of yours. Right, this is very, very basic math. So that's not all. And if you see this tree, you know where I'm going next, because that's only 40 or so generations. What happens if you go back 10 million to 50 million years? Suddenly you're related to every single primate that you've ever seen. Go back 500 million years or 1 billion years and suddenly you're related to every mammal that you've ever seen. The dogs on the street are your cousins too. Go back about 2 or 3 billion years and it's every multicellular creature. So every plant is your cousin. Go back 4 billion years and it's every single bacteria that's ever infected you with a cold is your cousin. If you look back at the picture of Earth that our best scientific models have come up with, and say you could play that and fast forward, say 5 billion of the last years could go by in 10 seconds, what would you see? You'd see a lot of water and rocks and air and lava turn into you. You'd see yourself sprout out of the earth. Just the same way that when you look at a tree and you see fruit sprout from the tree. So how funny is it that we don't see any of this? We don't see our relatives in the audience around us. We don't see our relatives in the animals and plants around us. And we definitely do not feel that we are the earth, just the way that apples are the tree. Suddenly we sprout out and we start thinking, I am a human being that is on the earth. I am a thing that is actually separate from the earth in some way. That to me is maybe the deepest mystery of how this thing can convince itself that it has ever become separate from everything else. So let's back up all the way. Right? This is an image from the Hubble telescope at NASA, and it's called the Ultra Deep Field. This is the deepest that mankind has ever looked into space. And I'm going to give you a little just idea of what it is to take this picture, because to me this is the most important picture that has ever been taken by mankind. The Hubble telescope, if you go out on a clear night sky, which we might do after this with the astronomy club, I'm excited about that, and you look just with your open eyes, you can see about 3,000 stars in one of the hemispheres. And in between all those stars, almost everything is totally black space. And so with the Hubble project, they wanted to look in one of the darkest regions that seemed like it had absolutely nothing going on in it. And the field of view, the kind of angle that the camera can see on the Hubble telescope, is so narrow that the equivalent is if you took a drinking straw out of your drink and you pulled it and you made it 3 meters long, and you looked through that at the sky. That's how little of a patch of sky this image comes from. Okay, so there's so little light coming from that image. A normal photograph that you take, maybe it takes 1/100th of a second to get enough light in the camera. This took 13 days to get enough light from that part of space to see anything. All right, but here's the punchline. When you look at that part of space, when you look at that tiny, completely black part of space, long and close enough, this is what you see. And if you look closely at this, you'll notice that every single dot in this picture is a galaxy, which has roughly 100 billion stars in it. So let that sink in a little bit. When you look into something that is completely empty, you see 1 trillion stars. How many planets are on those stars? Maybe 10 trillion on average, something like that? The mystery is that the more we look and the deeper we look, whether it be small or large, we start to see that the emptiness around us is full. And we start to understand that all of these things that look separate, we look separate from one another, we look like we're on the Earth, that looks separate from the sun, our solar system looks separate from the other ones in the galaxy, that galaxy looks separate from everything else. But the more we trace all these things back, the more that we realize that it actually was all one thing. And that the only thing that may have changed is that things started to look falsely like they were separate from one another. If we believe anything like the Big Bang, we know that everything was and is just energy, and certain patterns of that energy form into amazingly complex patterns, right? Those things form into molecules and atoms, they form into cells, those cells form into patterns of things like human beings, even into the patterns of human thought. And when we see another human being, we see the pattern, and we forget completely that they are made of exactly the same thing that we are made of. And so we build up this false belief that all of us are separate, and that we are controlling ourselves in this very chaotic world, and we always have to make all of these decisions on our own.